So I have one of the investors in C5 Capital with me, and he also invests in some of its portfolio companies, and that's Robert Gray. So Robert, can we ask you, why should we commercialize space? Why don't we just leave it for the big nations to continue doing it?
The nation should continue to do it, but when one looks at what happens when commercial enterprise engages in something, SpaceX is a good example, perhaps, of finding a way to make rockets reusable. NASA may have thought about this a lot, but it didn't really have a motivation to do so, other than going to the taxpayers for support for their missions is difficult as they're very expensive. But to go through all of the details of how will this rocket become something that can land on Earth again, be reusable, it wasn't really front and foremost in the missions that they were trying to accomplish. So even though it was a multi-billion-dollar opportunity or problem or cost, you might say, it wasn't really a priority for them because they're not driven by managing expenses for the sake of some kind of efficiency. It's really just so that the coffers that are available to them remain available, and that's laudable and understandable. But it loses something that commerce brings. So in space, the kinds of things that can be manufactured there that cannot be manufactured efficiently on Earth are many. One is in medicines. So with pharmaceuticals, you might consider a simple analogy of if you try to mix oil and vinegar here, you have to shake it, it has different densities, so it will tend to separate. In microgravity, which is near zero gravity, which you have up in space, the molecules will combine because there isn't a density issue without gravity. So the same analogy is used for many molecules that are made in pharmaceuticals. Once you combine them, then they're stable, and then you could bring them back to Earth. So you can manufacture medicines that could save billions of lives. And commercially, it could be worth billions of dollars. The cost of bringing things up and down to space is enormously expensive now. I believe it's in the order of about $1,000 per kilogram, which is a lot, but if you have something like a molecule, if you envision a pill that one might take, the amount of the pill that is actually the medical molecule that's helping somebody with chemotherapy or whatever it might be is actually a very small component. It might be 1/100th or even 1,000th of what's in that. So if you imagine that and say, well, a kilogram of that, a shoebox or so, that actually could be an enormous amount of value. But of course, you don't just suddenly get the medicine. You have to bring up the manufacturing materials to make it in this microgravity, and that's quite a challenge. But the costs will likely come down over time. That's not the only product, but making semiconductors in space, gallium arsenide is a material, a methodology of making chips that is extremely toxic. It's not really practical on Earth, but in space you don't have those kind of worries. And the amount of chips that you can get into a kilogram, the shoebox if you like, is a tremendous value. They're much faster and use much less energy than a silicon chip would do. It can be much smaller. But of course, again, you have to get the manufacturing up there, which is what Axiom Space is working on. So it's a fascinating company. And they're the only company that's going to be able to attach their modules to the existing International Space Station, which will be decommissioned. So they'll attach their modules, they'll begin this commercial product, manufacturing process for clients back on the Earth. They're already cash flow, they're revenue generative because they have contracts with NASA, and they're generating a lot of revenue already, bringing things up and down to the existing space station. In 2026, they'll begin their own. Their modules are big enough to put 2 double-decker buses inside. So these are significantly larger than what most people might imagine when you see pictures of how crowded it is inside these nodules today. So that's just 2 applications. There are many others. Making artificial organs in space is something extremely difficult to do on Earth because the scaffolding that you need when you're printing in 3D tends to either sag or have a scaffolding within it that once it's dissolved can become toxic to the body. In space, you don't have those kind of worries. Metal alloys, super high performance alloys, like the oil and vinegar analogy, very difficult to combine in gravity, but in where you have nearly no gravity, you can combine them, stabilize them, and bring them back, and they're valuable enough that it could be worth doing. Initially, it'll be expensive, maybe not entirely practical. Axiom may do some things where they help their clients bring things to space by sharing in the revenue stream from the products that are brought back. And that could, I think, has the potential to make this company as big as Apple or Microsoft or SpaceX someday.
And of course, there's the issue of IP that could be more protected if a company does all these experiments you've been talking about.
Yes, that's a critical point, is that the International Space Station, because a consortium of governments, I think Michael Sufridi mentioned that I think it was 15 governments, Sufridini, the CEO, founder of Axiom Space, he talks about how difficult it is to get 15 countries to agree on the design of something. But once they all pay for it and design it and agree how it's to be used, the products that are made, the experiments that are done up there are for all of humanity. But if you are a manufacturer, a private manufacturer of making medicines or metal alloys or computer chips, you wouldn't want your most innovative idea to necessarily be shared with the world before you have a chance to harness the market potential for it. So Axiom Space will have clients who are private, and they can pay to have their materials brought up to the station, do the experiments, and reap the rewards of that, which eventually, like so many other things, the telephone, the automobile, airline travel, etc., they were initially very expensive and only for the very affluent, but in time, as they scaled, they became available to everyone.
So you talked about the price of getting something into space, how expensive it is. So is that also the advantage of the private commercial space companies, is that they can do it much cheaper than NASA?
Yes, they can do it cheaper generally, and over time, I believe that accelerates a sort of positive snowballing effect, or flywheel, some call it. But you might say more selfishly for taxpayers, it's somebody else paying for it. If you want to go see how you can make some kind of metal alloys in space, well, let a metal alloy company pay for that. Why should you as a taxpayer pay for it when you want there to be more teachers and firefighters and road building and medical treatment for people that need it and so on? Why are you sending rockets up for something I don't quite understand? If I'm a taxpayer, that's difficult. But if you're commercial and you're saying, oh, I see, I can use gallium arsenide to make chips in space, and that's going to be $1 billion potential for me, of course I'll pay hundreds of millions of dollars to get this done. It doesn't cost the taxpayers anything. And if the company made a mistake, well, it's on them. Their shareholders can, take their stock price down or tell them that was a mistake. But for some of the companies out there that might do these sorts of experiments, they're large enough that they can take the risk without it burdening the rest of society.
So how does a company like Axiom Space address these geopolitical risks at the moment, that, with the war in Ukraine, with Russia and the US just in the past week at the United Nations at each other's throats? How does a company like Axiom navigate this space?
Well, to be clear, I can't speak for Axiom. I'm just a simple investor hoping that a company that's doing great things for the world will do well for its investors, including me. But my view, my personal view, is that if you read something like the China Daily newspaper, which is good for anybody to keep an eye on, how is the messaging being done in China? And you can see there is a drumbeat of oppression, a feeling of oppression. The Chinese view would be, we are very deliberately being held back. The Americans don't want us to be successful. Those drumbeats are near to, historically, drumbeats of war, very near, and it's alarming. I think we would do well to help demonstrate, message all of the good things about China and the Chinese people. The American people, I think, are happy for the Chinese people to be as successful as Americans are. Welcoming China and its ideas into some things may seem a bit dangerous, but to not do so is more dangerous. I'm not a diplomat, but diplomats tend to appreciate that taking the time to find some kind of common ground with someone who otherwise seems to be your adversary is time well spent. In this great city of Washington, I think Lincoln had famously said about McClellan, General McClellan, who was a very difficult character, when he was kind of embracing him and working with him and other people were criticizing, if I may paraphrase to be polite, better to have him inside the tent shouting out than outside the tent shouting in. So with China or Russia or Iran, and there are many efforts in this regard, but I think the United States is a little bit tone deaf, maybe even arrogant, to not notice how much these narrow messages are being absorbed by a population that could be balanced by hearing that we don't have anything against them, find ways to work together in space, on the moon. We don't have, missions to Mars eventually, et cetera, creating medicines, sharing ideas. On the one hand, if it's very commercial, you don't share it with anybody. But if you welcomed up, let's say, a Chinese manufacturer of computer chips and showed them, this is how your intellectual property will be protected. We're not going to steal it from you. You can make a medicine for a Chinese pharmaceutical company or whatever, like it would be Pfizer or Merck, but from China, and say, it's yours. You're a customer, you do your project up there and you get to keep it. You're not shut out of this so that you feel you need to create your own version somewhere else. And then it might just be a military version and you're so angry and incensed that you want to shoot down everybody else's satellites or whatever you might read in the popular press. It could happen. So welcoming people in and finding a way through that delicate path is tricky. Another company called Palantir does a fantastic job of, they started on the aftermath of September 11th, when there were so many recriminations about the three-letter agencies, the CIA, the FBI, the NSA. They all had individual information that they were very carefully guarding, because the way that they got the sources for this information was something that they didn't want to put at risk. And some folks said that had they been able to share their information, they might have averted the disaster. Each one knew sort of just enough that if they had coalesced their information, they might have reached conclusions that could have averted such a terrible disaster. And Palantir, the DNA of Palantir coming out of PayPal, so-called PayPal mafia, protecting themselves from various cyber attacks and criminal activities that were basically glorified credit card fraud. They were preparing to sell the company. They figured out how to stop that by looking at different patterns of information and then protecting the sources of it so they could share the information without revealing or exposing or putting at risk the sources of that information. So the approach that Palantir takes, for example, is done very well in the geopolitical arena now. It could be, I believe, extrapolated out to even countries considered unfriendly to us. Of course, it would have to be done with some guardrails and carefully done, but it could be done. And for space, it must be done. I think otherwise we will have, much more trouble in space than needs to be.
Robert Gray, thanks for those insights.
I hope it's somehow pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.